who owns Texas history. That word owns throws me off sometimes because we're talking about various perspectives and rolling those in. How do you interpret that kind of a question?
Well, I think it goes to what we have seen as battles over institutions and battles over ways of looking at certain events or times and saying that one way of looking at it is correct and the other one is wrong. And to that degree, my answer is nobody owns history because we are constantly struggling to better understand it, to look at the evidence as honestly as possible. The problem is that we're always looking at the evidence based on our cultural, our social, our demographic, our political, our economic situation.
That was the voice of Dr. Frank de la Teja, the first state historian of Texas, appointed by Governor Rick Perry in 2007. While at the University of Texas, Frank worked as a research assistant to Pulitzer Prize-winning author James A. Michener before going on to serve at the Texas General Land Office. He later joined Texas State University, where he chaired the history department and directed the Center for the Study of the Southwest. His career spans textbooks, museum exhibits, and documentaries, including work on the Bob Bullock Texas State History Museum, all centered on one idea: understanding how the story of Texas has been written, taught, and remembered.
From prairie winds to courthouse doors, these tales run deep to the Texas core. With Texas tales, there's always more. So come chase the past with Lone Star lore.
Behind the scenes, Texas historians are navigating a quiet but consequential debate, one that centers not on whether Texas history should be taught, but how it should be told. Long-established Texas State Historical Association, founded in 1897, has long served as a guardian of the state's historical record. In recent years, though, questions over governance and direction have exposed differences in philosophy within the organization, and especially over how to balance traditional storytelling with broader, more inclusive perspectives. In response, a new group, the Alliance for Texas History, has emerged, aiming to bring together academics, educators, and community historians to pursue what it calls a comprehensive and inclusive understanding of Texas's past. Both organizations share the same core goal: preserving and promoting Texas history. Their differences lie mainly in emphasis, one shaped by legacy and continuity, the other by expansion and inclusion. Dr. Frank de la Teja, our guest today, is uniquely positioned to help us understand this moment. He serves on the boards of both the Texas State Historical Association and the Alliance for Texas History, giving him a rare vantage point on how these debates play out across the broader landscape of Texas historiography.
You said that there are people who actually believe that they do own the history, or that their perspective matters perhaps more.
I think the problem stems from some people having a multi-generational connection to the place and belonging to a particular sector of society that has exercised a greater political and economic role than the vast majority of us. So when you combine those things, it creates the sense in some people that their version of the story is legitimized by having been here in the 1820s and the 1830s.
As we lead into this episode, I want to offer a short note about what you can expect to hear. Apart from my interview with Frank, you'll also hear from writer and scholar Joleene Maddox Snider, a former Texas State professor whose voice continues to shape the soul of this series. My aim as your host is to help frame Dr. de la Teja's insights within Jolene's immersive narrative, to clarify the debates, the disagreements, and the competing interpretations at hand, while avoiding the temptation to resolve them. So as we move through it, I'll point to perspectives shaping the conversation, voices that deserve to be heard, even when they're not in the room. Our goal isn't to decide who's right. It's to understand why this single question, who owns Texas history, remains so hard to unpack. After all, who has the moral and cultural right to tell each thread of the story? The answer to that really depends on your point of view. With that being said, however, let's turn to Joleene for more on what occurred behind the scenes.
The older man walked through the front doors, across the main lobby, past the bar area, and into the main ballroom of the Omni Hotel in Corpus Christi of the 2019 Texas State Historical Association's annual conference. No doubt some knew J.P. Bryan had arrived. Others probably guessed. Who else would have had the nerve to amble in with his dog trotting along behind him? This man is the single most important collector of Texana in the state, if not the nation. His Galveston Museum holds over 70,000 priceless and rare items of the state's history. He is one of the TSHA's main benefactors, too. If Bryan's handsome personage, confidence bordering on arrogance, and casual but pricey attire didn't alert attendees and book dealers to his importance, then the unmistakable aura of money and power would. Or maybe it was the dog. Bryan's Texas lineage borders on royalty in this state. He is a direct descendant of the Austin Bryan Perry families. Emily Austin Bryan Perry was a sister to Stephen F. Austin. After her first husband, James Bryan, died, she married James Perry. Coming to Texas before Texas was Texas, they settled in Brazoria County in the early 1830s and built the Peach Point Plantation. At over 12,000 acres, it was the largest plantation in Texas. It was as close to a real home as Stephen F. Austin ever had. When he was in Texas, quote, to home, unquote, as the 19th century term was, he was at Peach Point. One simply doesn't get more Texan than J.P. Bryan. This elegant man with his well-mannered dog would be one of the main actors in the schism and chaos that has gripped the professional and non-professional historical community of Texas since 2022, when Bryan stepped in as executive director of the TSHA. This blood feud is central to understanding just who and what Texas is. Who said what to whom, and exactly how whom responded is a whale of a story. But it is someone else's story to tell in its full-throated details and nuances. However, the gist of the matter tells us worlds about this creature, place, and state of mind we call Texas. The argument is also central to the crucial question, quote, who owns Texas history, unquote. That question is universal to any people desiring to tell the story of their nation. But in Texas, the importance of the question is raised to something akin to theology, the first coming, and all like-minded things in the realm of who we are and why we matter.
For some people, they take it back a century earlier. There's people who say, this is the way things are because my family was here back in the 1720s and 1730s.
And just so we are kind of being clear, is when we talk about 1820s, we're talking about the Anglo-Americans moving from east to west. But we go back a century earlier, are we talking more Spanish?
We're talking more Spanish. And people who have that attitude, I understand where the attitude comes from, but it is unfortunate because what it does is it attempts to delegitimize other perspectives, even other perspectives that might be just as deeply embedded in the Texas past as theirs. So, for instance, who's walking around explaining that my ancestors were here 100 years before the Spanish even arrived, or 1,000 years? There are indigenous people that have connections to Texas, but they're not on view. Recently, we have a case here locally. The Tonkawa came back. They have bought some land. They are trying to establish or reestablish their presence in the consciousness of Texans. What's that going to force them to do? Others to do? It's going to force them to confront a perspective that said that because we were Indian fighters in the 1820s and 1830s, we made Texas what it is today. In other words, it's a story that has been turned into one of cowboys and Indians. It's black and white, and it never is. And when you say that because my family was here and we had this history, that's all you need to know about that history, that creates a problem.
Frank's point reminds us that ownership isn't just about who writes the books. It's about whose experience is considered part of the story at all. From that tension between inclusion and control, the argument over Texas history begins.
Up until, I would say, at least the 1960s, probably more the 1970s, the real audience, or what was considered the real audience, was the white population. And the material evidence for that is that black schools, and in many places, the quote-unquote Mexican schools would get the hand-me-downs. They would get the books that were considered no longer fit for use in the white classrooms.
And by fit, do you mean physically fit or what's written in it?
Physically fit. They were worn, torn, abused. And in the fact that in large measure, up until at least the mid-20th century, quote-unquote minority kids were not expected to go on beyond the elementary or middle school years. The other aspect of it was gender. If women were homemakers, then really they didn't need to be in the history books either, because the history books were about the people who ran things, whether it was businesses or government or the professions. So when you consider all of those things and then you look at the textbooks, you can see who the primary audience was and what the people who constructed those textbooks and ordered them wanted that population to understand and how to understand it.
And do you think that the people who were writing the material, printing the material, selling the material, were they doing that to serve their audience because that's what their audience wanted, or were they doing that because they wanted their audience to think these things?
Well, it depends on which end of the textbook production process you're in. From a publisher's point of view, and that is still very much the case today, the publishers are responding to what the TEA puts out, which is based on what the State Board of Education has deemed important, and that happens through the standards. So there are state standards. Those state standards are then codified, and the TEA then is responsible for making sure that those standards are reflected in the materials that students get. The legislature has provided some leeway. It's not as restrictive as it was in the past when there were books that were authorized, and those are the ones that you had to buy. Now there's some leeway, and as long as school districts are willing to pay the additional costs of covering the materials themselves, they've got more leeway. But generally, the publishers want to make sure that they meet the state standards, and they want to shy away from issues that the State Board of Education has made it very clear are no-go zones, and that's the State Board of Education, which reflects the political interests of its members, who in the majority today are rather conservative, rural types, and on the other end, publishers who want to make sure that they can sell books. And so they're not interested in bucking the system. And I've explained this to people over the years when I've become involved in this discussion, and that is that they're a business. They're there to make money. And yes, they want to promote good, solid education, but by the same token, if some of what they do is going to be the cause for them losing business, they're not going to do it.
Frank reminds us that the way we teach Texas history has never been neutral. Every lesson, every omission carries the fingerprints of the people who decide what matters. But outside those committees and classrooms, the story has always been bigger, older, wilder, and maybe that's why the arguments never end. Moreover, the sheer size of the state makes even its history too vast for one version.
Lawrence Wright, interpreter of all things Texas, said it beautifully in the title of his wonderful book, God Save Texas. Exactly what does God need to save Texas from? The summer heat comes to mind. But to be more specific, God needs to save Texas from Texans. Maybe it is the sheer size of the state that spawns acrimony and disagreement. The state is such a large, diverse landmass, it is difficult to build and maintain a shared history and purpose. Sam Houston clearly understood both the magic and conflict of this land. The last words he uttered to his soon-to-be widow, Margaret Lee Houston, were, quote, "Texas, Margaret, Texas," unquote. Whatever Texas was, he revered it. But Houston had his share of down and dirty, rolling-in-the-mud fights over Texas. Houston's most lurid and well-known conflict with a fellow citizen of his adopted state was with Mirabeau Bonaparte Lamar. One can't blame Houston if he developed a sour attitude about Lamar from the beginning when they met in Texas in 1835. That name was probably enough to set Houston off. Texas was earthy. Mirabeau Bonaparte was not a name that belonged in Texas. It sounded sissy, fussy, just not fit for a man of the earth of Texas. Now, Sam Houston. There was a good, solid, useful name that stood on its own 2 feet and meant something. But the worst of the hatred between the two men was over Houston's affection and long association with the Cherokee Indians. He lived with them, and by most accounts married into them, and had children by his Cherokee wife. After the tragedy of his failed first marriage, the secret of the breakup only 2 weeks after the wedding never revealed, Houston resigned as Tennessee's governor. He took solace in the bottom of a whiskey bottle and retreated to the Cherokee to nurse his wounds. The tribe, combined with Andrew Jackson's pulling him back into a political world, brought Houston back to some sobriety, and then Jackson sent him into Texas in 1832. A large group of Cherokee had settled in East Texas in 1820. A sedentary tribe, they had built villages, homes, and established prosperous farms and businesses. It was Lamar who became the president of the Republic after Houston that took a Texas militia and rousted the Cherokee out of East Texas, the ones he didn't murder in the attack, that is. After that, Houston couldn't say Lamar's name without foaming at the mouth, and the feeling was mutual. Houston's last words to Margaret Lee Houston are documented, but there is an undocumented quote, sometimes attributed to him, that is so Houston and so pertinent to the current argument in the historical interpretations of Texas that it must be added. It speaks to the depth of feeling and emotion that surfaces in Texas brawls. It helps to explain why the argument between the TSHA and the Alliance has gotten so bitter and irreparable. Sam Houston and Mirabeau Bonaparte Lamar's feud was a pure, raw, palatable hatred for each other, and everyone in Texas knew it. So in 1863, as Houston lay dying in Huntsville, the word went out that the great man was soon to be no more. Folks started coming from across the state to pay their respects to Houston. Some camped in the yard of the Steamboat House, while others Margaret allowed admittance. But she was in a real quandary. What in the world was she to do if Lamar showed up? Usher him into the dying man's chamber? Shoot him on sight, or what? So she asked her desperately ill husband what he wanted her to do. Houston replied she should wait until he had passed and then, quote, let him in and tell him to kiss my cold, dead ass, unquote. If Houston might have survived his illness by a miracle of medicine not available in his time, he would no doubt have embraced the story and called it true and his own. He would have wanted to have said it. We can allow Houston that flight of fancy in the afterlife, for on that hot summer day of July the 23rd, 1863, Sam Houston owned Texas history. So who owns Texas history now?
That question has haunted every generation that's tried to define this state. For some, it's about pride. For others, control. I asked Frank this same question, and for him, it seems that the concept of ownership may be the wrong focus altogether.
Each historian is going to tell a personal story that is informed by how they understand the facts that they have gathered. To be honest about it means that if you find facts, if you find evidence that contradicts the way you've thought about things, the honest part is to include that, either by changing how you tell the story to reflect the stuff that goes against what you thought before, or by incorporating it into a polemic, stating, here's one side, here's the other side, there's evidence for both. So to be honest means that you're constantly challenging yourself to do a better job of explaining the evidence that you have found, not ignoring evidence, not suppressing evidence, not, which has happened, inventing evidence.
Honesty in history sounds simple, but I'm often reminded how hard it is for anyone to admit when they're wrong. At that fork in the road, there are only two paths: admit the truth or cling to the lie, usually out of pride. After all, when the evidence challenges the stories we've always told, the struggle becomes personal. And in Texas, that struggle isn't theoretical. It's happening right now inside the very institutions built to preserve the past.
In October 2022, J.P. Bryan took over the position of Executive Director of the Texas State Historical Association. He did so at no cost to the association, so it must have looked like a sweetheart deal at first. But as the months dragged on into 2023, things were not going smoothly. There were significant disagreements between staff, management, the board, the executive director, the officers, members, and just about anyone else left lying around the battlefield over whose history it was and how it was to be interpreted. By the time the dust started to settle, personal lawsuits had been filed and dropped, temporary restraining orders issued, trial dates set and canceled, resignations tendered, firings commenced, and an entirely new Alliance of Texas History organized. The battle lines were drawn. The TSHA, under Bryan's direction, was left in command of the old guard's view of history, while the Alliance claimed the viewpoint of modern progressivism. Both sides claimed to want the same things: a truthful, respectful, complete history of the state. But the fissures ran wide, deep, and even to the very doors of the Alamo. The Alamo has long been the most revered historical site in Texas as a monument for bravery, courage, patriotism, and liberty. A visitor to the Alamo is expected to understand the solemnity and devotion of the visit and behave accordingly. Voices are subdued and reverent in the main sanctuary. You can be a bit more yourself outside the main building, but you better mind your manners inside. The Daughters of the Republic of Texas controlled the Alamo from 1905 to 2011, when the state placed the site under the auspices of the General Land Office after a state investigation documented misuse of funds and neglect of the monument by the DRT. In 2015, the state finally wrested control from the DRT and the indomitable ladies that had set the decorum standards for so many years. When they finally withdrew from the premises in disgust and high dudgeon, they marched straight to their lawyers' offices and filed suit to keep the archival collection of 38,000 priceless items of Texas history they had collected over the century of control. They won. And today those items are in the Bexar County Archives in San Antonio.
History isn't only shaped by committees and boards. Sometimes it happens in small rooms, a luncheon, a chapter meeting, a conversation that turns uneasy. And it's in those moments you see how personal Texas history can feel.
I'll give you an example. I was giving a talk to a chapter of the Daughters of the Republic of Texas in San Marcos many years ago. And we were in the room, and I was trying to explain the problem with understanding things from from Stephen F. Austin's perspective, or actually Eugene Barker's Stephen F. Austin perspective. And I mentioned the fact that there was another history there from a Tejano, from a Mexican Texan point of view, and one of the older ladies stood up and said, "No, there was only one history. There was only one story."
Here we go.
And so I tried to explain very carefully much of what we've discussed earlier in our conversation about the fact that if you leave facts out, or if you weigh facts differently, or if you don't take account of facts that come along and make you change or modify the story, that then you're not being honest about that. She was having none of it. And finally, the chapter president had to cut off my discussion with her because I wasn't going to change her view of things, and obviously she wasn't going to change my understanding of how I should be doing my job. And so we often run into people like that. They think that because they come from a particular lineage, from a particular sector of society, that perspective should govern the way we see everything.
Yeah, and it's funny too, because even on the smallest scale, I lived in Corpus for the first 22 years of my life, and my whole family to this day, with the exception of my wife and me, pretty much lives on one little block. They all kind of, my parents moved in next door to my aunt and uncle, and my sisters now live next door to each other. But it's always interesting because if you go home, somebody will say, "Now, did you hear what happened at the barbecue last weekend?" And I get, the one house, usually my mom's house, I get that version. Then I go next door. Oh, it's the same story, but it's a little different. And I go down the street. Oh, my goodness, I didn't know that. And we're getting all these new details that are filled in from various perspectives. And that's sort of just a small microcosm of what we're talking about here,
That's perfect. That's perfect because that explains it. And so at the end of the day, you have to reach some kind of sense of what the story actually is.
Oddly enough, I hadn't anticipated that family analogy landing with Frank the way it did. But since our talk, and the longer I study this state, the more it begins to feel like a single neighborhood, full of families, all remembering the same events in different ways. Perhaps a look at the most world-famous event in Texas can illustrate this point further.
Every Texas school kid is taught about the Alamo, about how William B. Travis drew a line in the sand and asked those who would fight for freedom and justice against Mexican tyranny to step across it if they would stand with him. About how Davy Crockett, quote, king of the wild frontier, unquote, came to Texas to fight for the cause. About how Jim Bowie brought his famous knife to wield against the savage Mexicans. All of it was the stuff of legend and Texas myth. Texans were the good guys, and Mexicans were the bad guys, and there was nobody in between. Like most things, the truth isn't black and white, but lies in the great gray middle between the two extremes. And so does the truth of the Alamo when the pesky facts are brought into focus.
The fact of the matter is all societies have origin myths, and the Alamo looms large as the Texas origin myth. So if you're going to demythify the Alamo, you are in essence undermining the Texas origin story.
And is that a problem?
I don't know.
Okay.
That's not my job.
Yeah.
My job is to say that there were people inside the Alamo who believed that they were defending themselves from a tyrannical government that had come to take away what was rightfully theirs. Some of them were there, I am 100% convinced, saying that part of what Santa Anna and his minions were coming to do was take away our property, our human property, our slaves. So what I'm saying is that at the Alamo, you had people fighting for different reasons. You also had some Tejanos there, and they had a history over the last 30 plus years of fighting for local rights, going back to the Mexican War of Independence. And consequently, you got people who are in the Alamo because they are trying to defend a vision for Mexico that isn't represented by the Santa Ana government. And so the myth is the coalesced idea of Texas for Texans. The reality is the complexities of the rationales for behaving the way and doing the things that you do.
Jim Bowie had a very lucrative arrangement with the pirate Jean Lafitte, who operated off of Galveston Island, where he brought in slaves from other states. Some bought legally and some stolen, and sold them to Bowie, who sold them in Texas. Since Mexico had eliminated slavery in 1821, when they won their independence from Spain, this was a highly profitable but illegal trading arrangement. Many men, and women too, came to Texas just a day or so ahead of an irate husband or wife, the sheriff, or a bankruptcy court. Nearly everybody had their own push and pull factors for coming to Texas, some more push than pull. Since the northern provinces of Mexico was a foreign country, they were protected from United States justice and its many lawyers, but still in a land peopled by English-speaking Anglos, who, like themselves, were mostly from adjoining southern states. David Crockett was fleeing a failed political career and a bad marriage. Travis was no exception. What people visiting the Alamo usually don't realize is that Travis was only 26 years old, just a kid, really, and looking for a cause worthy of martyring himself for, or to win against monumentally overwhelming odds and be the hero. At 26, few of us realize just how fragile life is and how limited our mortality might be. There were those who came to fight for the Alamo because they really believed the Texans were fighting for liberty, freedom, and states' rights from Mexico, and that the Alamo was a strategic site that mattered. In the first case, the right they were fighting for was the right to own slaves. Even today, people will vociferously argue that slavery was not the cause of the Texas Revolution. But in the first half of the 1800s, there was no other right of the people of a state on the political landscape but slavery that was worth risking your life over. It was a noble fight, but an ignoble cause. In the second case, the Alamo was not strategic to the Texas cause. In general terms, it sat so far out on the edge of the western frontier of Texas as to be nearly meaningless to the inhabitants of the province of Tejas, as Texas was known by its Mexican government. By virtue of their domination, the land belonged to the Comanche, Kiowa, and a smattering of other tribes. Was not suitable for raising cotton, and the Texans had not learned the value of those rangy cows with the long horns they occasionally encountered. In fact, the beasts could be just about as mean-spirited and dangerous as the Native Americans were, and Texas settlers wanted to have nothing to do with either of them. There are two versions of just what Houston told Bowie when Houston placed him in charge of the distant mission. Houston, in later years after the Battle of the Alamo, claimed he ordered Bowie to take all the cannons, blow up the buildings, and come east to join the main force that Houston was commanding. Reports of events at the time indicated Houston suggested to Bowie it might be best to follow his plan, but didn't exactly order Bowie to do so. It probably was academic what Houston precisely said. There were not enough mules or oxen in San Antonio that Bowie could have commandeered to pull the caissons of all the artillery, and he certainly did not want to leave the weapons for Santa Anna and Casas armies to collect and use to shoot at Texans. Additionally, Bowie was desperately ill, with either pneumonia, yellow fever, or tuberculosis. Take your pick. He had married into the large landed Veramendi family years earlier, and their main compound was just off Alamo Plaza. Bowie's wife Ursula died several years before he did, but he maintained a close contact with her family. He went back and forth between the Alamo and the Hacienda in the early days of the contest, partly to see to their safety and partly for rest, medical care, and decent food. So which Alamo story, along with the other Texas lore, to believe? It depends in large part on your attitude toward Texas. If your Texas is the land of the glamorous stories of the John Wayne movies told by aging Texans in small towns across the state, then you might prefer the viewpoint of the TSHA. If you are of a more progressive bent, then you likely will prefer the Alliance's take on Texas history. One historian who heads another Texas regional historical organization and was instrumental in organizing the Alliance wrote the following, quote, "It's amazing to me that after years of struggle to fight these reactionists and racists, we have made no more progress than we have. It's all so depressing," unquote. You can just feel the pain expressed in that message. Several people have discussed the possibility of the two groups making common cause in the future and coming back together. If they are talking about a future 30 to 50 years out, then maybe a conciliatory reunion might be possible. But the rancor and disharmony is such that it would be unlikely in anything resembling the near future.
In taking a closer look at the competing views of the Alamo as the most famous Texas origin story, it occurs to me that if anyone chooses to reinterpret a story of that magnitude, people get scared. It's not always about politics. It's anxiety. Because if the story changes, it feels like they change, or that something they took pride in is being taken away.
So it's a difficult issue, and I can understand anxiety, I can understand fear, and there are certain political actors who have taken advantage of that anxiety, of those fears, and mixed them with anger to then create a reaction against that in order to preserve what they think is the traditional, the correct view, the correct understanding of what they don't realize, of course, is that too is an ideology.
As a reminder, none of this is meant to funnel anyone to a particular belief or to choose a side, but rather it is to raise awareness of the fact that multiple opposing truths can and should find a way to coexist. And perhaps that's what we're seeing here. Two truths, two traditions, and one shared anxiety about what happens when the story begins to change.
One thing about the mentality of historians that is built into their very being, they have very long memories. So what brings about these diverse and often vicious arguments over the telling of Texas history? It is not that new facts are discovered. The details and documents are fairly well known by readers and writers of the field. It is the interpretation of those facts that is the rub. If Texan authors have heard all their lives that the Alamo was a heroic battle to the death for liberty and freedom against tyrannical forces of evil, then authors will favor the interpretation of facts that confirm that belief. The facts that may speak to the contrary remain buried in the archives. But history is no different than biology or other human systems of learning. Everything organic evolves, grows, and changes, and the discipline of history is no different. New historians are born, educated, learn to research, and start writing every day. Those younger, newer, differently trained scholars read the same facts their ancestral historians read in earlier times, but they see things differently. After all, they live in a different world from those who came before them. They reinterpret the facts from another angle, another vantage point, and when they do, the story changes. Maybe, just maybe, Travis was an arrogant kid who made a tragic misjudgment. Maybe Bowie was so ill he failed to act in time. Or maybe Santa Anna was a dictatorial politician playing general who failed to negotiate a better plan with the Texans. Maybe a lot of things. Now here is what both sides have failed to fully comprehend. Because of the evolutionary nature of the practice of history, What the conservatives call the revisionist viewpoint will one day in the future be revised itself. All historians are revisionist. They spend their careers, if not their entire lives, reading the works of earlier historians, going to archives and libraries, only to write their interpretations of what earlier works covered. But someday, it is their works that the newer breed of their profession will be writing about and offering up new viewpoints on. And so it goes. But that does not fully explain why these differing interpretations of state history get so nasty in Texas. It has a lot to do with the state itself, its size, and its people. Texans are an arrogant bunch who believe they are right in all things. They don't back down, and they are really lousy at compromise. The state has a history of characters who tend to be larger than life. Now and then, the reputation is well-deserved. Texas breeds a people that are as cantankerous as they are generous and friendly. Some of these qualities are derived from the land itself. It can be a harsh place to exist, even in these civilized times. For instance, when your air conditioner goes out and it's 112 degrees outside. But whatever made Texans tough in the beginning, it has entered their genetic composition and it must be considered and dealt with. Maybe Texans just haven't fully evolved. Factoring in the evolutionary concept, maybe the TSHA has just run its course and doesn't understand the beauty of making a well-planned exit. Another historian called the TSHA, quote, a staid, tired old conference, unquote. There may be truth in the statements of both people, even in Texas, where people are prone to beating their heads against the walls of immovable objects just to prove their points. They do finally recognize and evolve to the point where they move on to better things. Once they make it around that corner, they are not at all shy or timid in challenging the established order in the interest of what they see as a better choice. So who owns Texas history right now? Which side has the most astute scholars? Who has the best pencils, pens, computers, and research? We shall see.
From prairie winds to courthouse doors, these tales run deep to the Texas core. With Texas tales, there's always more. So come chase the past with Lone Star Lore.